Hey,
Hey Kev, how's it going?
hold on. Hey man, how you doing?
Yeah, well, how are you?
Good. Sorry, I had a Wi-Fi problem
Oh, okay. Uh,
as usual.
how's Canada?
It's
Canada.
gets worse all the time. What can I say? It's
I see you got the bank manager from London over there these days.
yeah. He and Camilla came over to do their thing in Alberta, and then oh god, it's all tied up with the oil and gas, and he's handing over authority to the local native chiefs to make deals with China directly, cutting out the crown. That's why he did all this talk about recognizing, that the land was not legally ceded. He actually said that.
The land is
So
not
not ceded was not lawfully ceded to the
sea.
natives. Ceded as in like the crown just took it, and he's acknowledging that. So
Okay.
that means he's giving more autonomy to the band council. These guys are all millionaires lining their pocket with the oil and gas deals they're signing, right?
So,
So
so, so
Charlie, yeah,
these are the fake native elder.
yeah, the mob they're called by all the natives. They're just criminals. I mean, they're like they're the drug and child traffickers on the reserve, and they're in big with the Chinese triad mob, and um, like like the people are lining up with China, Vatican, the Crown. They're all heading that way, so they're kind of enabling the big
Was it you
takeover.
told me? Was it you told me that all the Vatican loot, the financial weight of the Vatican had moved east to China?
Yeah, yeah, more and more. The guy who's in now, I did some shows with Sean Atwood that were incredibly. They've reached millions
Yeah,
of people.
I just
Been
saw you
selling
had
tons of books.
300,000.
About 1,200 copies of my books are sold in the last month. It's just fantastic, right?
In
But
the last month.
one thing I was, oh yeah, yeah. After the interviews with him, we did four of them, I think, and reached hundreds of thousands of people, and they were all started. The book I wrote on the Vatican dethroning rogue power,
Okay,
that
the
one
ban.
about how the Vatican's a criminal power. And one of the things that came out, I started getting calls from new eyewitnesses, right, including people who know about the present guy and the so-called American Pope, right, Prevost, Robert Prevost,
From
and
from Chicago.
Leo.
From Chicago.
Well, he was born there, but he's a dual citizenship in Peru because he did all his work down there, and he's one of the ones who opened up the Chinese. The Chinese are second South America dry too for all the mining and stuff like that, all the minerals, and it happened right in his diocese. But there's a whole history he has. But he's also been seen at the Ninth Circle ceremonies. Two women, I've interviewed them both, and they were participants. Their stories are just like Tos Nienhaus, word for word, same thing,
Right.
you know, of what went on. And it was part of kind of an induction ceremony. The month they killed John Paul I for investigating the Vatican Bank, that was
Okay,
September
so was
78.
this the pub that only lasted a couple of weeks or something? The really short one, and then ended up murdered or suspiciously dead in his bed
28 days.
after 20 days.
28 days. The same month, this present guy took his first vows as a Catholic priest and was present with John Paul II, who took over at a ceremony in the basement grotto kind of area under the St. Peter's Square. And you see, they take a vow to the church, but they also take a vow to the Ninth Circle. It's kind of like a mirror relationship. And then they have a list of safe candidates for popes. They go on a red list, right? If you participated in these ceremonies, you can get in. If you don't, you're on a blacklist. You never get in. Right? It's like in government. So this stuff is all coming out. They even claim. I've been talked to the. There's a new court setting up, and there's a prosecutor being appointed, or a common law court, right?
Well,
He
well,
said,
I listened to your interview with what's her name, Emma Catherine. And
Emma,
you said there's a new setup is that the one in England you mentioned, or different completely?
uh, well, setup. Like, how do you mean a new setup?
I think a new republic.
Oh, you mean in England? There's a
Completely different. No, don't let me interrupt you. We'll come back to this.
there's an organizing committee in England that's more active now, based on they saw the interviews too, and they're kind of charged up about it. But no, all I was saying about that was that this prosecutor has alluded to the fact that another source inside the Vatican claims in the secret archives there's a log of all the Ninth Circle ceremonies going back to 1870 and the names of all the participants, and his name is on it, kind of confirming what the eyewitnesses are saying, right? And so, yeah, it's
so
really
these
interesting.
these two new eyewitnesses that correlate exactly with Tours Neil House, right?
Yeah.
You've interviewed them what recently within the last couple of months,
Oh, in the
and so
last
they
month,
get then submitted to.
they, yeah, there was a Zoom meeting. They're both older women, German and Polish, and same old story. Their parents were part of the cult. They were brought in at a young age and taken to the Vatican often. Um, yeah, and so there's also secret testimony from apparently a member of the cult who has the court grants immunity for people who give testimony, right? And this guy's I don't know who he is. I haven't seen the interview, but apparently he's been in touch with them. He claims to be a member. You see, in the Ninth Circle, it isn't just the participants. They have a group of secondary people around them who don't take part, but they're an administrative group that protects them. Like, buys off politicians, gets police on board, and he's in that. He's like some kind of church official, but he's in the support infrastructure around the actual participants, right? And he has apparently a lot to share.
He has.
A lot to share. He knows a lot about their history and their connections. And these are like, it's
And
like,
then am I right saying that there's? I think you were chatting again with Emma. You were saying that there's a big hearing court get together for the end of the summer, autumn time, and will these guys be giving testimony in that?
the courts already, the judges have already gathered. Some of the ones who did the one about Ratzinger, about other new people, they've already appointed their prosecutor, and they're going to formally convene the court September 1st, Monday, September 1st, and then they're going to issue the summonses that week, including to the guy in Rome, and his other people have been named who were his associates, right, who took part in, right? Like there's people in America, there's people in Peru, there's a whole long list of them, right?
Okay. And then back to the China situation. So is it basically just a power shift? Just one location to the next, which you can track it through history. Goes London, then Washington, and next to China. Is it as simple as that?
I think, well, it's not simple, but generally speaking, I think that's true. But like, China's the only country in the world where the government appoints the Catholic bishops along with the church. They have kind of a dual power thing going on in China. And remember when Bergoglio came to Canada to sign that deal to underwrite the Chinese takeover of the resources here and the infrastructure? Like they bought up all the West Coast ports now. All the containers are owned by China. And you wouldn't believe it. Like like all over northern BC, and I've seen this for myself, it looks like China now. It's like there's been massive Asian illegal immigration. It's all allowed legally under this act Trudeau passed, right? Which we talked about. We've talked about that before. Stationing Chinese troops in that. They have these prostitution camps operating near the oil and gas operations, PetroChina, Sinopec. They bring in women off the street, native women, to service the workers, and then you never see them again. We've had people up north documenting this, right? So and of course it's all, as you can imagine, just blacked out of any media, including alternative media. Nobody wants to touch this stuff,
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed, BitChute has gone, or maybe it's just here in the UK. It just evaporated about a month ago. Nobody on this island gets BitChute any longer.
Really? Well, I'm not surprised. Yeah, and they're bringing in the thing in England that they've got in Canada about euthanasia here. There's a bill before Parliament this week allowing people and encouraging people to take their own life. And also something about new taxes coming down on if you own televisions or something. Like it sounds really Orwellian stuff that's coming in now in England.
What a TV license tax?
Something like that. Somebody mentioned that in passing. Maybe I'm Don't quote me. I heard something about that, but this euthanasia law is definitely being debated right now.
There's an online safety bill here that seems to be quite powerful, if you like. Again, Orwellian censorship, as you're alluding to. But Kev, on the China thing, so we had there was the Mao takeover revolution in the 60s, if I'm right. And my Chinese history isn't great. Was that very contrived? Was that very much, with the global power shift in mind, do you think? Or,
Well,
or was there
it's
some
kind of
authenticity to it?
well, Mao came in 49, 1949. Like there was a civil war in China in the 30s and 40s, and Chiang Kai-shek, who lost, he was the one that the U.S. was backing because Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, they were fighting the communists more than they were fighting the Japanese during World War II, and they were using American supplies and doing that. And the Yanks woke up to that and they began to back Mao, just like they did Castro in Cuba at first, right?
Ah,
And then Mao kind of went his own way, something the U.S. didn't really anticipate. And it's the thing about China is it's a structure a lot like the Vatican. It's corporatism. You got the emperor at the top, and it doesn't matter whether it's the Manchu dynasty or Mao. It's the same idea, right? You got the all infallible leader at the top, and everybody just goes along with it, and that's a perfect corporate structure, right? So they're kind of pre-adapted to help each other that way. Like they don't clash at all, and there's no separation of church and state. In other words, and even in notion of that. So naturally, England would go along, monarchical system still, basically, and they
yeah,
go
sounds very
along
much
with.
like it does.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The
So
head of
how
state is
you
head of church.
how you been anyway? What have you been up to? I've been curious about what you're doing.
Yeah, good. Nothing much really. I've just been just ticking over doing a bit of teaching
Oh yeah.
English as a foreign language, and yeah, just keeping up to date with bits and bobs here and there. But yeah, I was very interested to read your the intro. So I've just been, since watching your interview with Emma this morning, been looking at this green book. Let me just get the title right here.
Governing ourselves, the one I
Governing Ourselves, a handbook on personal, political, and spiritual sovereignty.
yeah.
Yeah, and plucking a couple of quotes, because one thing I have been doing is, coincidentally, on the theme of, having a good think about that slave master relationship. And I never in my life have I been interested in economics until the last few months. I've been quite interested in economics recently, and so that historical development from, well, you got some good quotes from Rousseau. I've been reading in the intro to the book, and so Rousseau is very much about personal sovereignty, right? And not, and what do you say, expelling that slave and master relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so as we move away from slavery, as we advance through history, we get to capitalism, and we
Mm-hmm.
got the employer and the employee. So
Yep.
so over to you onto sovereignty, because you're saying in this book, I think, that there's a complete contradiction with two definitions.
Right. You mean about what sovereignty is?
Yeah.
People's notion of it. I like that quote from Abraham Lincoln where he says, when the Civil War was breaking out, he said, everyone talks about freedom. Some people see freedom as a right to do what you want with other men, and other people see it as a right to be free from that. Right. So use the same word, but you've got two fundamentally different things going on, right? So that's the trouble with language, unless you get down to specifics saying, well, what do we mean by that? Right? Like, what do we mean by sovereignty? Just means you're governed by your own laws and nobody else's. And a sovereign can't be anything more than a people. Like one person can't be sovereign over somebody else. It's a contradiction because sovereignty exists inherently in everybody. So how would we all surrender our sovereignty to one person? It's like saying sell your soul. You can't do it, right? But you breed slaves with the idea that there she's my sovereign and he's where's the contract? Where do we ever agree to that, right? And that's all. If you read all the stuff that in 1649 when the English set up the first republic, right? They all talk about that. They say, any monarch, pope, king, whoever, is blasphemous because you're usurping God's authority. God's the only authority, right? Not a man. And that's kind of runs through that whole idea of sovereignty, including with Rousseau, right?
So would you say that Rousseau then in the mid 1700s, moving through to the USA independence, and then further on to the deposing of the European kings in majority was on account of, was spurred by the Rousseau idea of the end to slave and master. But then,
Absolutely. He was a philosopher of the French and the American revolutions, but his ideas led directly. They're all quoting Rousseau, right? But England is still operating in Canada under Hobbesian, Thomas Hobbes.
right.
He said there is such a thing as a sovereign, and in return for him protecting you, you surrender your sovereignty, right? And you're subject all the time to this one ruler, you know. And so that Hobbesian notion is another form of the slave master relation, right?
And then as these republics arrived, the Italian, the German, the French, etc., etc., then the aristocracy, the guys who wanted to maintain the relationship, the slave and master relationship, they shifted it and twisted it
Yeah.
and distorted it into employer employee with capitalism. Is that
Well,
a
yeah,
fair summary?
yeah, because I mean, in the early years, like in the Industrial Revolution, you form a union and you're dead. It's an illegal association. That's why a lot of them were transported to Australia for even striking or English history is filled with those examples. You were seen as a traitor if you organized to oppose the employer, right? And
Well,
and then it got statified, so it's all integrated now. Like unions just act very much as arms of the state now. Like you saw that during COVID, right? People getting fired for not wearing masks, their own unions wouldn't even defend them because they had an agreement with the state, right? And I found that too, all the time. The unions were like, they're just an arm of the state, like the churches are now, right?
and is that where the crime of sedition comes in?
Yeah. Sedition was an attempt to challenge crown authority and overthrow it. Well, treason is the act of doing it. Sedition is the thought of doing it. Although common law says no one can be tried for their thoughts.
Okay.
Treason in the U.S. Constitution, treason is simply trying to overthrow the government at the behest of a foreign power. Right. That's it. The act of trying to do it. Not. I mean, I can get up and say, I want to kill the president, I want to overthrow, but that can't get you in jail. It can now because they're going way back. They're turning the clock back to pre-common law almost. But yeah. So
So we're at this point now where we've got these. It seems very much to me like the USA is being prepped and revved up and made ready for a civil war, right? You've got these blues versus reds, which seem to be at an extreme that we haven't seen before, and that what do you say, the scuppering of the USA is in stark contrast to the rise of China, right?
Well, China's subsidizing it all. I mean, wouldn't you? Like you divide, like Sun Tzu says, you divide your enemy, get them to fight each other, and that way you overthrow a bigger enemy. They're just sitting back and funding both parties, and Trump's involved in it. Trump International is one of the biggest human traffickers because they fund the Mexican drug cartels who are behind a lot of the cross-border human trafficking. So remember how Trump was separating the children from the immigrant families in prisons? That's a sure sign of trafficking, right? Like it's right in front of people's faces, right? And that all helps China, right, to rip America apart. I mean, and I think I don't see any counter motion like, away from that, because it was divided. The vote was 77 million to 76 million Democrats, Republicans in the presidential so-called election, and right down the middle, right, just designed for the Civil War is already happening, right? And
With the army in California, for example.
Well, yeah, and just he does everything possible to create mayhem and confusion and war in America. Like, who is serving? You think people would be able to step back and go, who's that serving? But they don't get past that emotional.
with
Yeah,
with your finger on the pulse I always feel that the USA is the pioneer country, the people that crossed the ocean in order to start up the common law and the sovereignty and the dissolution of the slave master dynamic. But this concept and philosophy of liberty has created tyrannies, singular or plural, over to you, that are exactly the same as, well,
yeah.
like we're talking about other dictatorships, that we recognize throughout history.
Well, history always goes in a cycle, right? Things that start out one way end up their opposite, and that's the dialectic of history. And I think that you know, um, I mean, look at what happened in Russia or in England. Their revolutions were turned on their heads and become their opposite, right? So, um, no, but I think I like that quote from Rousseau. He says, "Freedom is carried in the heart of every free man. It's not expressed in a government. You take it with you wherever you go." And that's why what I'm counting on now. This is a seed all over the planet now. People going, no, we're not going to be part of this new world order, right?
Right. Yeah, I've got it. Oh no, I've got a quote from Thomas Paine from your book, which I really like. As the American patriot Thomas Paine wrote in 1791, no man can represent another and thereby rob him of his sovereignty to govern himself. Whether a king or a president rules over others, it amounts to the same thing when it comes to the indivisible rights of the people, namely abject subordination.
Yep. Well, look at what's happening now. I can't believe this is, you know, Trump rules by decree, like an absolute monarch. Executive orders. He
Exactly.
writes a law and everybody obeys it. But it's the most basic tenet of America is that we will obey no law in which we've had no say. You can't just rule by decree. I mean, I don't even know how Americans are standing by and letting this happen when they're not revolting, right?
Well, over to you. You're on the same landmass. How are Americans going to like balancing this internally or mentally, cognitively,
They want
when the whole place is built on an anti-government sentiment? The whole Bill of Rights and the Constitution is built on anti-government sentiment, and
in,
you got
I
this
know, but
oligarchical tyrant.
that's kind of a sentimental belief. Americans always say, like, we believe in liberty, but when it comes right down to it's an extremely hate-filled nation. And the demagogue comes along and says, "Trust in me." And I get this from people who are normally quite intelligent. As soon as the topic of Trump comes up, they go, "Yeah, but he knows the way. He's the only one who can save us." And I say, "Hello,
What
are
did you
you
say?
saying
He knows what?
he
Before
knows the black hats are taking over, and he represents the power that's going to overcome the
5D
black hats?"
chess or whatever it is.
It's like this millenarian belief in the savior, right? And they can't even see what they're saying or what they. And at the same time, they say how much they love liberty and say, well, that's why you need a guy in there writing laws out and everybody obeys them, right? When they shouldn't be obeying them. They have no standing. One man rule has no standing in the American Constitution. Statute without consent is not law. So they can all just ignore him and should. If they were real, quote, Americans, they would be ignoring him or removing him. But, you know, it's the same old. It's like Hitler, very much like Hitler. In fact, their personalities are very similar. Um, like psychopathic narcissists, where
Right.
whenever he makes a statement about world affairs, he says, "I will do this." Not we, the people, not the government of America. I will do this. I have the best. You know, it's just crazy to watch, right?
Yeah, it's astonishing. It's astonishing, and there's a sort of dark irony that the Chinese is based on the equality of communism, so to speak, and yet it's extremely capitalist tyranny, if that's a
Well,
fair
they're,
way to
they were
describe it.
never.
Whereas the
Yeah,
USA is based on liberty and freedom, and yet it's complete lockdown from the top, from a
that, that's
demagogue.
that's because all the ideologies are converging into one, and that's totalitarianism, like a global totalitarian regime, right? And this crosses the left-right spectrum. Those terms I don't use anymore because, yeah, you can have a libertarian impulse and be a conservative or a lefty, or and you can have a totalitarian impulse and be either, right? It's which do you believe in the people ruling themselves or being ruled over? I think it boils down to that, right?
There's a guy doing the rounds over here. He's a really interesting guy. He came up from the back streets of East End of London, and he got to the top of university with economics, and then went to one of these big merchant banks, and he's he's turned his back on it all, and he's doing these podcasts. A guy called Gary Stevenson, and Gary's Economics is his YouTube channel, and he's really interesting with regards to taxing wealth, and this is catching a lot of attention, and people, I think he's simplifying it for people to understand the corruption and the what do you say, the deception of how economics works. And so his big point is tax wealth and level it in terms of economics.
Money, from the perspective of society, cannot run out. It can only pass from person to person. It can only be held. So if the government has accumulated a huge amount of debt, all that means is some other group of society has gotten rich. And it doesn't mean that we as a society have lost our resources. It's very, very important to understand that money is not real resources. Money is, I think I described in another video, as a competitive resource or a distributional resource. Money is only used to determine who gets the real resources. And if you have lost a load of money, that can only be because somebody else has gotten a load of money, because we know with guaranteed certainty the total amount adds up to zero. And I think this idea that money, we've run out of money, I mean, it's really powerful in politics. The big thing is after 2010, when the Labour government was voted out and the Conservative government was voted in, there's this, we've run out of money, there's no more money. There's no more money. And it's totally impossible. And because money is only a distributional resource, we know that if a problem can be fixed by distribution of money, we know that that problem can only be a distributional problem. You cannot fix a lack of resources with money. It's not possible. Because money is not resources, and money cannot create resources. If you don't have enough energy, you need to go and get some more energy. You need to get some more coal or some more wind power or some more firewood or whatever you're using for energy. You can't make it out of money. But I think it's been used powerfully against the Labour Party. They've said, they spent all the money. But it's actually quite powerful to understand that money can never run out. Resources can run out. And, there may be instances, for example, this year just gone, we've seen there's been less energy and the energy price has gone up. Resources can run out, but money can never run out. The government can never run out of money. If the government has run out of money, somebody has that money. If the government has gone into debt, somebody has that debt. It's really important to understand money. You as an individual can run out of money, but society can never run out of money. And if the government has gone into debt, it is because somebody has accumulated money. So it's always in balance.
But you go back to Marx, and Marx saw himself, if I'm right saying, as the antidote to capitalism. That once you get rid of capitalism, you don't need Marxism. So right. So is that employer-employee relationship exactly the same as slave and master when we're back to sovereignty, and that you have to scrap the monetary systems, or at least revolutionize?
So. Yeah, I think so, but you can't do it above a certain level. I mean, real direct democracy can't exist in too large a society, right? You got to decentralize everything to make it work. And don't forget, Marx was talking about laissez-faire 19th century capitalism. And now I think the traditional capitalist proletariat thing is disintegrating, because you got a system a lot like what Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia was, where the state is this big behemoth and it controls trade, industry, prices, like everything is controlled by a central source, like in 1984, right? So, kind of like the Stalinist wing of communism has merged with fascism into this new kind of thing that people don't understand because they're thinking in old terms, right? Of left, right, and all that. Capitalism, communism, those things don't mean anything anymore. You got this global corporatocracy, and then whatever we're going to create as its opposite, and people are still fishing around for what that is. I think we're in this kind of foggy middle period where transitioning to something, and that's what I see as the biggest problem, when people aren't clear about what's really going on, right? And they're looking for old models, and especially in internet where it's so confusing all the time. You know, the latest theory is coming out of left, right field. And who do you believe? What's true? You know, it's, I don't know.
Well,
I get that.
so you've got this hub of wealth, right? And it used to
Yeah.
be, you know, Wall Street in the West, and it looks like it's now shifting to China and
It's
the
all,
East.
it's all in Asia now. Most of the economic growth, 80% of it's in Indo-Pacific area.
Right. And
They've
so,
got bigger economies. Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Brazil, they're all bigger economies now than the US in terms of GNP. And, you know, the US is shrinking to nothing. And it's probably going to be a patchwork of warring states uh, controlled by China, you know, them pitting warlords against each other. That's how I see it.
as the wealth drains out of the
Yeah.
nation,
Yeah.
and everyone's scratching around for a couple of cents and a couple of bucks here and there, and it creates the tension, and it creates the consternation and the conflict.
Yeah.
And then everybody marches to the beat of the tune of where the new hub of
Right. Well, that's the thing. Now, it's not just China. Russia's a competitor, but I see Europe being. I think Europe is going to go with Russia, and there'll be China and the Russia European bloc against each other eventually. Um, you know, and that's why people aren't stupid. That's why I think the Crown is backing the China right now, because they traditionally what held NATO together was America, right? And
Right.
NATO is floundering around. Well, okay, de facto, they're going to have nature abhors a vacuum. They're going to go in the direction of Russia because they're closer and the dominant power. Although, you know, they're going to make noises about, you know, opposing Russia and the Ukraine and all that. But I think where else can they go? I mean, it's,
So whether it's a nation or an individual,
yeah,
the 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 concept of sovereignty
yeah,
dissolves into you know, a hunt for a couple of bucks to put some food on the table and a roof over your head. Can I
I
read
mean,
another quote from the book? This is the heart of the matter. For any declaration of sovereignty by the people creates a de facto, you just use the phrase, a de facto state of civil war and dual power between them and the state and those it serves. This is especially true when people declare their spiritual independence, for then they have begun to see and feel things in a fundamentally different way that cannot be contained by the
right.
status quo. They have, in the words of Sun Tzu in The Art of War, established their own ground of battle and thereby mastered the spirit or chi of their enemy by asserting their own. In a practical sense, this is how every kind of sovereignty is created and enforced in the face of the power of the old regime and our declaration of independence from it. Spiritual sovereignty is the axe that separates us from the old system. Personal and political independence follows from it, as does the inevitable war of independence.
Right. Yeah. And of course, that's written in a traditional situation. Now, a big determining factor is the technology and the degree of mind and group control that it exerts. And that's the thing you find, you know, I always give the example of these assemblies we set up. People didn't have the ability to actually enforce decisions they make. They hadn't regained their own sovereignty enough to be able to say, yeah, we can create something new right now. We're going to do it. And things have got to fall apart a lot more than they have up to now for people to realize that it's sink or swim time, right? And I don't think we're at that point yet. Still a handful of people trying these things, you know.
Again, back to your fabulous interview with Emma, I just listened to this morning. You spoke about education and people detaching from the education systems, and you know, we talked about the USA again. That whole Biden situation basically propelled everybody against the Democrats who wasn't or who were against that, you know, clear brainwashing into sort of sexual deviations that the Biden administration seemed to be promoting, and so.
Well,
You know,
they,
again, I'm really interested in that. You know,
yeah.
your finger on the pulse in terms of the USA. That you know, are there lots of these breakaway education systems that, you know, remove that? This is why kids go to school into kindergarten. It's because they learn that master slave authority from such a young age as a priority. You know, the rest is just window dressing, right? The point is, you teach the kid like the elephant with the chain around his the baby elephant at the circus with the chain around his foot. he can't break it. He's not strong enough. He tries and tries
Yeah.
and tries, and then gives up. By the time the elephant's an adult, he's not even interested in trying to break it when he clearly could.
Well, here's the thing about the whole thing about Biden hatred is it was very contrived. And you saw this many years ago, all over the internet. Whenever there's a report on somebody in Hollywood, buggering kids or whatever, they all happen to be politically liberal. You never heard about, they were all Democrats. They were always liberal-minded people who were trafficking children. It was never any conservative or Republican leader. It was always, so it was very partisan right from the very beginning, right? And it was a definite attempt to try to demonize Democrats in order to facilitate this civil war. In fact, in reality, child trafficking in this happens by all politicians. Anyone involved in a position of authority, political power, financial power, they're all doing this because it's one of the most lucrative things on the planet. So it's a political tool to be able to point the child raping finger at your opponent. And unfortunately, what happened in America, this big groundswell in opposition to COVID, it all got corralled. If you want to call it the far right, okay, fine. I don't like to use the left term, but the Republicans knew how to corral it because they knew they weren't, you see, Democrats and liberals and socialists even are tied into the state so much that they don't have any leverage mentally to, or freedom to be able to say, oh yeah, it's big pharma at work here, right? So the whole anti-pharma kind of anti-globalization thing got corralled by, in America, the Republicans. And neo-fascist groups all over the world play into that. The same people who say oppose big pharma are saying, yeah, let's get rid of all the Jews and the blacks and the Asians, right? So, I mean, it's this, the opposition movement in the world today is 99% controlled by one wing of the corporatocracy, right? And it's like the hand playing the two political oppositional figures against each other, right? I mean, the two political leaders.
Dividing classic.
It's the same beast behind it. And the thing is, like we've always said, look at the thing behind it controlling it, not the hand puppets, right? People seem unable to do that for some reason, right?
Right, yeah, 100%. It's in lockstep. Whether it's blue or red, who cares? It's the same. Two wings of the same bird, right? And
Right.
that creating that division was the contrived agenda, and how that was done, is interesting in terms of details. But the blues were, Trump perhaps being the conclusion of it all. Biden helps make extremes of the two, and then you clash them against each other, as we're beginning.
As a matter of fact, to be honest, I think they were colluding all along. The Democrats colluded with the Republicans. Here's an example.
Sure.
Trump was impeached twice by the House of Representatives, and he was a convicted felon. So under American constitutional law, he's therefore not allowed to run. If you've been implicated in any way with an attempt to overthrow an election result, which he was, the whole January 6th thing, you're not allowed to run for office. And yet the Supreme Court stepped in, two of his appointees say, oh yeah, you can run. Well, then the Supreme Court is colluding in an unconstitutional act of treason. They should have all been stopped. And the Democrats could have done that because after the election, it has to be ratified by various levels of government. Why didn't the Democrats not ratify it? Because they had every obligation to do that. And yet they go along at every point. That's the point. The big money is behind both parties, and they needed the appearance of an election and opposition to make it seem like there was a choice. In fact, they all get their payoff, right? It's like after 9/11. Did anybody go to jail over penetrating the airspace over the Pentagon? No, the Air Force general got promoted. So the proof is always in the pudding about what's really going on. And that's why we can't think in terms of Democrats or Republicans anymore. There's, the American elites, whatever you want to call them, they've made the choice. They've got to, just help destroy the country. They'll get a seat in the new Chinese empire. And then they take on Russia and Europe. I mean, that's the way. I think that in 50 years or less, there's going to be a huge war between Russia and China. And
so you don't have a prediction. You don't have much hope of a high percentage of Americans just turning their back on the whole thing and saying, I'm keeping my sovereignty. I'm no longer going to give my sovereignty to the Reds or the Blues or the Church or whatever.
There's a lot of people, and in fact, one of the reasons, if it was a fair election, which they never are, they're always arranged. But there were a lot of Democrats who didn't vote. And who those people are, and I meet them all the time, a lot of poor people who say, this is bullshit. This is a rich man's game. Why vote for either of them? They had moved beyond that, and they were open. If the Democrats were serious, like Bernie Sanders could have done, could have formed a third party based on the populist American traditions. Like in the 1890s, the Populist Party that said both parties are run by big money. We need a people's party to take back power. That would have tremendous support in America now. But where's the leadership? There's no leadership on a national scale possible, because you can only do that if you've got big money behind you to run on a national scale. And locally, it's happening all over the place. Those are people I meet in our common law, activities where we're setting up common law courts and assemblies. I meet those Americans all the time who want to do that, but how do they coalesce? You can't accept locally and maybe regionally, and we're trying to encourage that, like with the Republic movement, right?
And I think we've spoken about this before, perhaps a few times, but I'm right in saying, I think, stop me if I'm wrong, that locally in the USA, the sheriff has more power than the president and the governor. It goes from grassroots up rather than top down. And yet when we have this situation where the governor of the California tells Trump, don't send the troops in, we don't want the troops, but Trump supersedes him, overrules him, whatever you want to say. There's that question mark, therefore, about how the constitutional works in terms of local governors, local jurisdictions, and so are Americans question this whole situation with regards to local sheriffs and local jurisdictions?
Well, no, because the problem is everyone is tied into the corporate media so much, and even the alternative media, they don't really see what's going on with this stuff. And they don't even think in those terms. Like, you've got a criminal regime operating that ignores the Constitution, right? It doesn't operate. The Constitution is a dead letter now in America. And when you try to stand by it, you're called a domestic terrorist, So it's ironic, on the 250th anniversary next year of the American nation, they've gone full circle back to King George, although it's worse than King George, because he wasn't an absolute monarch. He was a constitutional monarch, and Parliament had some weight, in affecting what happened in the American Revolution. There were the Whigs trying to stop, the Britain from fighting the Americans, and that. Trump is an absolute monarch, like the Pope, or, Chairman Mao was, or whatever, right? He's unaccountable to nobody. That's the thing to understand, and people seem to want that now, right? A lot of Americans.
So people seem to
want that. A lot of Americans.
Well, they're all brought up on kindergarten teachers, ruling the roost in like a dictator, and Disney films where the king in the castle is the boss man. It's educated in, right?
There should never been a president in America. That was not the original Republican model. John Adams and the Federalists, who were very pro-British, they modeled it on the British monarchy. The king was the president, like the president's like the king. The Senate is the House of Lords, and they're the ones who hold the power. And then down there is the House of Commons, the Congress, who have minimal power. And people have had this all along, and yet, they call it something else, not a king.
One last quote, Kev, before we go separate ways. Genuine political sovereignty is as far removed from elite-run democracy as spiritual sovereignty is from organized religion. And for the same reason, governance must always remain in the hands of the people for it to reflect and uphold their innate liberty and the natural law of equality and harmony from which it arises. The kind of genuine political self-rule emerges naturally when people acquire a sense of their spiritual and personal freedom, as when the Puritans escaped royal and papal absolutism in Europe. What made their Mayflower Compact unique was that everyone who signed it pledged themselves to uphold one another and their own governance. It was a sacred promise, a covenant that united the first Americans into a new collective sense of themselves. Mayflower Compact, I don't know, this is a document, is it?
Yeah, it was 1620.
Plymouth Rock.
Yep. Right after they landed, they wrote the covenant together, and it was the basis for later things like the in Connecticut, a few years later, or a generation later, they adopted something similar that said authority arises from the people, not a monarch. and government can be dissolved by the people. So Americans have to recover that and get their mind out of this thing they're in now, that they've somehow achieved that by electing a dictator, right? And yeah, a spiritual renewal at grassroots is what American and the whole world needs, and that's why we're really encouraging this in other nations, the formation of sovereign republics, and we got a new interest in England for that, right? A lot of people are writing in now saying they want to, I think because Charlie is so unpopular, right? He's an unpopular monarch, and
He really is. He really is. Well, you think about it. You got Charles and Jimmy Savile, and then you got Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein, right?
oh God, yeah.
Coincidence?
No, and so that's why I'm coming to Europe in the fall too, to help with the court case. Yeah, to help with the court case, to help the prosecutor with this whole, Pope Leo mess, and also to people have wanted me to come back to England and give talks and that. So it'll be interesting. Like I said, well, I was deported in 2011 in the spring, and we'll see.
You might have a big queue at passport control.
Right. Well, somebody said, Kev, we'll smuggle you into the country by submarine at night. Land me off the Devon coast, right? Okay, great. Let's do it.
Fly to Dublin and come on the ferry. Work for me.
Yeah. But I'll keep you more posted about that, Owen, and others. And
yeah, for sure, definitely. Let's catch up. Let's have a cup of tea. And I was going to ask one more thing. Yeah, so this, as you mentioned in your interview with Emma, there's a new common law republic. You showed us the book, Case for the Republic, the Case for Canada.
Case for Canada, yeah.
And that prompted you to think that there's someone new arriving in England.
Oh, well, I've been contacted by people. I didn't reach out. I was contacted by a number of people, Scotland, England, who, and of course Ireland, we hear from all the time. People who say, it sounds like this is a good time. Like it takes a while for the seed to start sprouting, right? And right now we've reached a critical mass, as we've talked about in the world. There's this 100th monkey thing happening, right? Where people are going, okay, let's get out of the whole mess. Let's learn how to govern ourselves. Just people don't have the knowledge and the tools of how to do that and the confidence they can do it, right? So
it's your great example about the piston. There's lots of steam, but we got to create the pistons, right?
Right. And you do that locally first and getting your feet wet. And that's where you have the power anyway, because people think in national terms, like, let's have a big protest in London, right? No, that's not what you do. You don't go on the radar like that. You just start building
a request to the oligarchs.
Local assemblies, you out of sight, off the internet, just start doing it. And people are like, one of the people is in touch with this farmers network in England that's providing food self-sufficiency and getting people to distribute it directly from the farms, set up new networks. And I see that all over the world, people doing that kind of spontaneously on the ground. We just need to give it a kind of a bigger name and a vision and organize people together, right?
Yeah, it's communication, isn't it? And media being the word. It's for me. It has been for a long time the big block to it all is coordination through communication. Back to Rousseau in the 1700s, it was printing press and leaflets, right? And they couldn't censor it. They didn't have algorithms to stop paper being passed around.
Well, that one of the books I just wrote was the one on my ancestor, Peter Annett. I don't know if you've seen that. I'll send it to you. It's
you see the guy you had an interview with your dad once. Was it?
Yeah. Well, oh no, that was about my Uncle Bob who died in the war, and the British Admiralty covered up the friendly fire sinking of the Canadian destroyer he was on. But no, this is Peter Annett, my free-thinking ancestor in London. They stuck him in the stocks at age 70 for writing these pamphlets denouncing the Church of England. And, but what I did in the book was I not contrasted, but showed how our lives were so intertwined. And people keep saying, no, you got to be this guy's reincarnation, Kev, right? Because you're carrying on the battle. But I'm going to be giving lectures in England, right at the spot in Charing Cross where they had him locked up. And that should be fun, right?
I'll bring my camera, and there's a long line about it. So I remember the other one who marched halfway, traveled right halfway across Canada to get to the battle against the Crown. He didn't make it in time. What was his name?
Right. Philip Annett. He was so his dad had been a Waterloo veteran in the British Army, and they got free land in Upper Canada, what's now Ontario. And so all the Annetts went out there in 1829 from Wiltshire, where we lived in a little town called Frome. And
I lived really close.
oh, it's such a great place. I love that area, Glastonbury and all that. But anyway, no, he took up the musket. His son Philip, they were Baptists. It's one of the other reasons they had to leave, because they couldn't legally practice in England, right? Because you had to be licensed, take an oath of loyalty to the king. Otherwise, you'd be banned and hanged and jailed or whatever. So they came to Canada, and then they find the same thing going on over there, this monarchical system operating. And that's why Canadians kept going west all the time to get away from the crown and, intermarrying with the natives. That's a whole other story, right? But Philip took up a musket, and they were marching off to London, Ontario to overthrow the crown. But then the rebels in York, what's now Toronto, got stopped. And so it dissipated. It failed. And they hanged some of them and deported a lot to Australia. And, the usual thing that you do to rebels in arms. But anyway, that's a proud family heritage, all of it.
From a long line of rebels.
Oh, God, yeah. As a matter of fact, I'm thinking, here's what I've done. I've written an open letter to Charles, and it's very funny, and it's actually saying, Charles, now is the time to abdicate, because look, you're criminally convicted of all these things. You're as the CEO of this criminally convicted power, you need to stand down. It's nothing against you. You're just born into the shit. So I will invite him to attend one of my public talks, and we can debate the issue of why the British monarchy is over, and we need a republic in England. So it's a formal public invitation I'm making to him. And gee, maybe he'll come. Wouldn't that be great? Me and Charlie going hammers and tongs.
Yeah, you wonder how it is for him. He must see the whole platform crumbling.
Yeah, I mean, these people aren't dumb.
He'd probably take a get out clause if one was available for him, and he could just remove himself from the center of the chaos.
Right, that's the thing. These it's like the little man behind the big mask. They're just people, right? And it's
behind the curtain on the Wizard of Oz screen, right? The little man will believe us. Yeah.
Right.
Good to chat, Kev. Let's do it again.
Yeah, we'll do it soon. Thanks, Owen.
Read. I'm gonna put it in order. Read it all rather than just the Amazon intro bits. But it looks great.
Okay. Great.
Chat soon. All the best.
Thanks a lot, Owen.
Cheers, Kev.